What were the consequences of industrialization that make up Unit 6? To begin with, there were ideologies and imperialism. The period between 1750 and 1900 was marked by a range of ideas that justified imperialism. Social Darwinism promoted the idea that stronger nations would naturally dominate weaker ones. Nationalism fueled pride in increases of a nation's influence. This idea still dominates much of the planet. It can be positive when it encourages actions like independence or the Olympics, but dark and negative when it encourages conquests and violations of human rights. Europeans frequently viewed their actions as a civilizing mission to uplift others. Some Europeans still reach back to this idea to try to justify the past actions of their countries because they are uncomfortable with what they did. If your country did wrong in the past, take accountability and try to do better in the future. Religious groups aimed to convert local populations. This was especially funny in countries like Ethiopia, which had frequently been Christian longer than the countries that the missionaries came from. Europe was still the new global players in many ways. In some regions, power shifted from private individuals or companies to governments. This could happen after state corporation misdeeds and rebellion like the Sepoy Mutiny. It takes a lot to unify the Muslims of Pakistan and Bangladesh and the Hindus of India or Bharat. But there were other variations. After international outcry over the actions of King Leopold's Force Publique soldiers in the Congo, King Leopold II lost control to Belgium's government. Tipu Tip, the second most successful slave trader in history, had sold Leopold slaves and the services of the soldiers. The Belgian government's takeover led to improved regulation, but ongoing exploitation. It's debated how many people died, but the Congo faces continued challenge. The Dutch East India Company handed over control to the Dutch government in Indonesia and Southeast Asia. This was not as a result of any of their harsh policies, like the genocide of the Bandanese, but simply because the Dutch East India Company became corrupt and less profitable over time. This resulted in tighter state governance and more direct colonial management. European nations in Africa expanded through force and diplomacy, securing influence and resources. Key examples include Britain in West Africa, as a step before they eventually would run railroads from North to South Africa. Belgium's King Leopold II with a personal colony in the Congo, and France in West Africa with countries they still hold economic power over in some cases. Different regions sought power and took on different strategies to expand it. In the United States, the U.S. pursued westward expansion through treaties, purchases, and military campaigns, leading to the removal of many indigenous populations and Mexican control of vast swaths of territory. Russia expanded eastward through colonization and military conquests, focusing on Siberia and Central Asia. They ran into more trouble than they expected with Japan, though. Japan pursued island control, emulating Western military and economic strategies while fostering a strong national identity to resist Western influence. They took Taiwan, then Korea, then fought Russia for more islands, and as a prelude to what came later from them, for China and the rest of Asia. Spain and Portugal saw their influence decline, with their territories shrinking due to competition from other European nations like England, France, and eventually Germany. Europe used different imperial strategies to maintain control over the colonies, scattered all over the planet. The different European approaches to colonial control included both direct governance and economic manipulation. France centralized administration in its colonies, emphasizing assimilation. Their economic imperialism lingers. Britain sometimes allowed regional autonomy to maintain stability until it all broke down after World War II. King Leopold II of Belgium governed the Congo directly with harsh economic exploitation. The Belgian government used less terror and murder, but they still killed the newly elected leader of the Congo, Patrice Lumumba, after the Congo was finally free. Spain and Portugal relied on older systems of colonial governance, struggling to maintain influence. They held slaves as long as they could, but did not industrialize in the same ways the others did with bigger empires and greater technological resources. English established settler colonies in New Zealand as they expanded their global influence. The Maori fought back until they got the representation that even the Americans had not earned from Britain. There were also attempts in parts of South Africa, and Cecil Rhodes wanted to paint as much of the map in British red as possible, and had designs on the US and full control of China. State building altered and began through internal and external factors. Growing nationalism and distrust of colonial rulers led to resistance movements and the establishment of new states. A prime example of direct resistance, Tupac Amaru II Secondos led a rebellion in Peru and sought to return the Incas to power. He did quite well for a time. Samori Touré fought military battles in West Africa, resisting French colonial expansion. His country held on for many years, doing their best to retain what freedom they could versus outside encroachment. The Ya Asantewaa War represented resistance against British rule in West Africa. The British disrespected the golden stool of the Ashanti, and she encouraged the country to fight back. Even though the results were mostly exile, she regained some pride for her country. The 1857 rebellion in India was a significant uprising against British control. It was so powerful that the population of Bharat could act unified, that the British removed the British East India Company and instituted Crown control, the start of the British Raj, which ran till 1947, and partition. New states like the Sokoto Caliphate emerged in modern-day Nigeria. Nigeria was able to acquire a sense of pride, even as struggles with the way that the continent would be divided through imperial convenience, rather than by tribe, loomed in the future. The Zulu Kingdom resisted British encroachment in South Africa. Unfortunately, the monarchy was not as strong after Shaka, and they could not find the path to innovate and advance effectively enough at warfare or to acquire greater imperial connections to other regional powers. Independent states emerged in the Balkans, disrupting Ottoman rule and altering European power dynamics. This changed the fate of the Ottoman Empire and halted the flow of Janissaries, though immediate strife unfortunately occurred as all the Balkan states fought for power. Newly formed states had different impacts on their regions. The Zulu Kingdom fiercely resisted colonial encroachment, while the Sokoto Caliphate expanded its influence through alliances. In the Balkans, new states altered the balance of power in Europe, contributing to geopolitical tensions. Bulgaria tried to conquer the other countries. Serbian nationalism was fierce. The Ottomans slipped, and World War I got closer. Within these new states, societal changes included evolving governance structures that ignored their prior traditions, shifts in social norms to an embrace of their original cultures, and adjustments to economic practices like capitalism. Some rebellions were based on religion rather than rebellions based on nationalism. They were driven by spiritual beliefs. The ghost dance in the US embodied spiritual hopes for the future. The dancers thought they could make themselves resist bullets and make the white colonizers leave. They could not. The Xhosa cattle killing movement in southern Africa reflected faith in traditional practices and prophecy. They thought they could kill the cows and defeat the white colonizers. Sadly, it led to famine. The Mahdist Wars in Sudan sought to establish a religious state. They killed England's General Gordon, but they could not hold up to pursuit and machine guns. They're some of the inspiration for Frank Herbert's Dune. The Boxer Rebellion came from the idea that China could be purified through resisting drugs, practicing martial arts, and driving out foreigners through capturing Chaoyang, Beijing's embassy district. They held it for 55 days. Sadly, the foreign powers occupying China sent in troops, and the Qing government finally sold them out. Global economy development shifted and changed throughout this period. Some of the factors were environmental. Industrialization demanded raw materials and food supplies, fueling export economies worldwide. Profits from raw materials like cotton in Egypt, rubber in the Amazon and Congo Basin, and palm oil in West Africa helped purchase finished goods. Other notable export commodities included guano, which is bird poop from the guanay cormorant, from Peru and Chile, meat from Argentina and Uruguay, and diamonds from Africa. There were economic factors at play as well. Industrialized states practiced economic imperialism in Asia and Latin America, expanding their influence through economic control. Britain and France grew their power in China via the Opium Wars, and British companies funded the port of Buenos Aires. The commodities trade and the beginning of futures worked underneath all the imperialism. It was about money. The global trade in specific goods gave European and American merchants distinct advantages. Opium from the Middle East and South Asia was exported to China. Cotton grown in South Asia and Egypt was shipped to Britain. Palm oil from sub-Saharan Africa and copper from Chile flowed to Europe. Migration patterns were impacted by environmental factors. New transportation methods encouraged both internal and external migrants to relocate to cities, driving 19th century global urbanization. Some migrants were able to return home periodically or permanently. Examples include Japanese agricultural workers in the Pacific, Lebanese merchants in the Americas, and Italian industrial workers in Argentina. Economic factors altered migration as well. Economic shifts prompted many individuals to migrate for work. Irish migrants sought opportunities in the U.S. British engineers and geologists worked in South Asia and Africa. Coerced labor was a factor that should be acknowledged. The global economy relied on forms of coerced labor like Chinese and Indian indentured servitude and convict labor. Convict labor often involved prisoners working on infrastructure and plantations, particularly in colonies like Australia and Southeast Asia. There were other coerced labor systems that began or continued then too. Other forms of coerced labor included sharecropping and forced labor on plantations, where workers often faced exploitative conditions despite legal freedoms. Sharecropping became widespread in the American South after the Civil War, trapping many formerly enslaved people in cycles of debt. These systems made an impact on internal migration. Improved transportation within industrialized nations led to mass movement from rural areas to urban centers, reshaping societal norms and family structures. As cities grew, rural regions saw declines in population and traditional economic activities. There were cultural shifts from the internal migration that took place as urban centers became a mix of rural customs and new urban lifestyles. Countries are not the same after urbanization. You can see this in the intense rural and urban divide in China now. This often led to tensions and the creation of distinct subcultures in cities then. There was an impact from this rural migration into urban areas. Like I mentioned before, the migrant situation in modern China changing might have more of an impact than they believe. Migrants altered the world then. The influx of workers into cities boosted urban economies through manufacturing, trade, and services, while rural regions experienced a decrease in agricultural productivity due to labor shortages. This unfortunately made the poor in the cities hungrier than they might have been before. Migration patterns had significant impacts on society. Male migrants often left women to assume new roles back home. Migrants created enclaves that preserved their culture in new environments, such as Chinese communities in Southeast Asia, the American islands, and the Americas. Indians in East Africa, the American islands, and Southeast Asia, Irish in North America, and Italians in the Americas. Despite economic benefits, societies weren't always welcoming. The Chinese Exclusion Act and the White Australia Policy are examples of efforts to regulate the increased flow of people across borders. What was the impact of imperialism? The rise of industrial capitalism improved living standards for some while revolutionizing manufacturing methods. Consumer goods became more affordable and varied. Meanwhile, the period marked significant political upheaval, with old empires crumbling and new nation states emerging. The growth of transoceanic empires and a global capitalist economy dramatically altered migration patterns, increasing the flow of people worldwide. What do you think matters most now? Tell us in the comments. Share this video with your friends and classmates. Like the video and subscribe for more AP history.